Hi, good evening, and welcome to the start of FAN's spring programming. I'm Lonnie Stonich, FAN's Executive Director, and I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Dr. Thomas Fisher and Natalie Moore. FAN's a nonprofit organization that presents a high-quality speaker series offered free to the public on a wide variety of topics, including human development, mental health, education, and social justice, among others. We have over 175 videos of past events archived on our website and our YouTube channel, so please be sure to explore. Now for introductions. Thomas Fisher is a board-certified emergency medicine physician at the University of Chicago Medical Center, where he serves the same Southside community where he was raised. Previously, Dr. Fisher served as a 2010-11 White House Fellow and as a special assistant to Secretary Kathleen Sebelius. He worked on an Affordable Care Act regulations and the Health and Human Services Action Plan for reducing racial and ethnic health disparities. The Emergency is his first book, and he has garnered high praise for his poignant portrayal of humanity in crisis and his underscoring of the critical obligation all of us have to care for each other. Natalie Moore is an award-winning journalist based in Chicago whose enterprise reporting tackles race, housing, economic development, food injustice, violence, segregation, and inequality. Her latest book is The Billboard, a play about abortion, published by Haymarket Books. Her acclaimed book, The South Side, A Portrait of Chicago and American Segregation, received the 2016 Chicago Review of Books Award for Nonfiction and was BuzzFeed's Best Nonfiction Book of 2016. Ms. Moore contributed to South Side, a collection of stories about the criminal justice system in Chicago, in collaboration with the Marshall Project and Amazon Original Stories in 2018. For the 100th anniversary of the 1919 Chicago riots, she co-wrote a 30-minute audio drama with Make Believe Association that aired on WBEZ. 16th Street Theater adapted portions of The South Side in 2019. Ms. Moore has interviewed Ta-Nehisi Coates, Jesmyn Ward, and Karn Regis Bethencourt for FAN, and we are grateful for her engagement with our programming. And now, let's welcome Dr. Thomas Fisher and Natalie Moore.
Awesome. Thanks for having us.
That. Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Lonnie. I am really excited to be in conversation with my dear friend, Tommy. So before we really dig into the book, I would like for you to tell us a little bit of your origin story, because the South Side is just as much a character in this book as you and as your patient. So tell us about, who your people are and who you come from.
Yeah. First of all, it's so good to be here with you. Thank you for agreeing to be my partner in this conversation this evening. It's something I've looked forward to for quite some time. I am a Chicago native. I grew up in Hyde Park. I grew up not far from 53rd and Hyde Park Boulevard, which is the park that sits right across the street from where Mayor Harold Washington lived when he was mayor. I was a kid at that time. I was in grade school, but I remember very clearly when he was elected mayor, how much that area changed, where there was security sitting across from his apartment building and the snow got cleaned that much faster along our streets. I grew up in one of the few racially diverse communities in the city, but it was still, and it is a Black community. And my parents were very intentional about making sure that we were a part of all of it, right? We went to the fish owner was Jesselson's Fish Store, which was owned by a Black man. We had a shoe repair that was Black owned. We ate Baldwin ice cream that was Black owned. We would point at the boats in Jackson Park Harbor that were owned by pillars in the community. We ate Leon's barbecue, which was Black owned. We were very much a part of a dense community of folks that were like us. And I think in many ways, that's how we became friends, but it's also launched so many other folks like us. And I think one of the things that I remember really clearly was when Obama's star was rising and we were as happy as everybody else in the country. I remember how the news media remarked about, wow, this is an amazing and unusual individual. And I was like, he is an amazing individual. Unusual, we see folks like this. There are professional folks who went to all of the best schools who are Black and live on the South Side. That part for us wasn't unusual.
And
so
that's what Michelle Obama's mother used to say. She would say, Craig and Michelle aren't special. The whole bunch of Craigs and Michelles all on the South Side.
Yeah. I don't think I realized that nationally, maybe that's a little bit unusual, but it wasn't unusual for us. So.
Yeah. So, reading this, there's so many, I knew many of the parallels that we had, where we're from, education, family, being grandchildren of the Great Migration. But one thing that I didn't know, and there's so much that I wrote in my book that you wrote in yours, but the death of Ben Wilson both affected us. And he was killed in 1984, Simeon High School, All-American basketball player, killed across the street from Simeon.
Yeah.
And that for me was I might've been 9. That was my first understanding, I think, of violence in Chicago. I remember it on the news, his mother, Mary, weeping, the students weeping, Jesse Jackson. How did his death affect you?
I remember those exact same touchstones. I was a kid, but sports were very much central to the way I engaged the world, right? I wanted, I set a metronome for when the White Sox were playing, when the Bears were playing, when the Bulls were playing. And so having a professional caliber player in the community, right, not far from us, getting coverage on the front page of our local newspapers, it was startling and amazing, and really made tangible that these folks that we see, like Walter Payton, like he's very different, like he's grown and but in fact, they come from somewhere. And here was somebody who had the potential to reach those same heights. And he's like blocks away. Simeon is 1.5 miles from where I grew up, not far at all. And so when he was struck down, not only was it jarring that like a celebrity was killed by a gun at school, but then the outpouring, then that same amount of mourning was also proximate. The people who were upset were also members of the community, the funeral processions. And I think not only did it make real that violence was going to be an ever-present part of my life, and that was the first initiative, but it revealed, it started a pattern. We didn't see this happening to the White Stars that were emerging. We didn't see this happening on the North Side or in our suburbs. We saw these things. That was the initiation of a pattern that began to emerge, where not only was violence close, it was ever present. It was in my high school. It was, when we would go out in high school, go to parties, like one of the big things we would think about, and I assume you were thinking about this too, is, are they going to shoot at this party? That was just, we didn't just have to consider, is this going to be fun, or what am I learning in school today? But what's the right pathway home today? Because it seemed like there was some static in the hallway. Parties at this place got shot up last week. Maybe this weekend we're going to keep it light. All of that began with Ben Wilson. And I think that talking about Ben in the book, Benji in the book, made clear that for a lot of Black folks on the South Side who are of our age, even a little younger, some older, it was a sentinel event and something that we all sort of sat on and learned from moving forward.
Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote the foreword, and he opens the book in Bronzeville when you all were at my condo. and we were just hanging out, and then there was a murder across the
Mhm.
street. And we've talked about that many times, but we've talked about it more like, can you believe this happened? And seeing a body just laying there uncovered for so long, bleeding. But one thing that Ta-Nehisi wrote that I hadn't considered was, he and I are journalists and we observe, and he wrote, this is real life for Tom. Can you talk about just that arc between, okay, so Benji had this mark on you, the fraughtness of high school, and then what you see in the ER?
You know, I remember that night really clearly because I remember remarking, man, those gunshots were close. And then the next thing you know, it's so close that there's a body across the street. Well, now that the University of Chicago has a trauma center, I work in the busiest trauma center in the state. And on a hot summer night, we see tens of young men who are perforated by the bullets that fly through our community, and men and women, in fact, who are bleeding and suffering. And on the one hand, it is really important for us to be there, right? To stop the bleeding, to repair what we can. And on the other hand, most of what we do is bear witness. We have no capacity to reshape the sort of social and cultural framing that lead to these bullets flying through the air every Saturday night on the south side of Chicago. We can bear witness to the impact and we can stop them. But we know what makes a neighborhood safe. I mean, Lincoln Park is a safe neighborhood. We know that is not about policing. That is about investment, and that is about a racial hierarchy. That is about the way in which we prioritize profit over people. I can't fix those things in the emergency department. I can only see the physical manifestations of an unjust society in the bodies of my patient. And I can see that day and night, year after year, and I see these patterns emerge. And so, look, part of the point of the book is to bring that intimacy and an understanding of how our bodies express our society and how they do so differentially, and to recognize the shared humanity, even in those moments, even when it's difficult to understand what's going on, that, you know, the young man that we saw murdered was somebody's brother, right? That's somebody's father, somebody's uncle. And these sorts of things, even if they seem foreign and are reduced to statistics, are still human events that we shouldn't tolerate.
The first sentence, the first page of your book is chilling, and it takes us back to March 2020. You know, we're living in this pandemic, but it's a lot different from where things started, and completely unknown.
Yeah.
And you don't mince words. You thought that you might die, and you were getting your affairs in order. I just can't imagine what it was like to be a doctor and to give care, and then to come home and decide to write. How did you construct this book? Because the detail is incredible. Were you journaling when you came home? Was this a way to release the tension, the sadness, whatever emotions that you were feeling? And then were you always planning to write that was this always going to be your book?
Yeah, there are a few things in here that I think are worth picking up. I was already journaling to some extent. Part of what I see when I'm taking care of patients is complex and heavy, and writing it down helps to alleviate much of the conflict, or at least clarify what's going on in my head related to usually the gap between what I wish we could do and what we actually could do. So I'd been journaling for a while. When COVID fell on us all, I'd been watching it since January, and I write this in the book that I'd been watching foreign press, and I still do that to better understand when viruses are emerging across society. Like, I also want to know when there's shootings in the community. I want to know when there's new heroin on the streets. I need to have a pulse on what's coming. And so I watched this emerge from China and circumnavigate the globe, going from Italy to New York to Seattle to Chicago. I saw doctors getting sick and dying. One of the first deaths in China was one of the doctors who discovered the virus. We didn't know what this was going to do. All I knew is that I'd been training for this. This is what emergency medicine does. We stand in the face of pandemics, and we sit at the interface between the medical centers across the world and their hospitals. And we are trying to take care of people in these moments. And so I knew that all of a sudden, this distance between what it meant to be a physician and what it meant to be a patient would be collapsed. Normally, we're working in teams and taking care of very sick people, even in life and death situations. And we can be clear-headed knowing that at the end of the day, we're going home. We're going to have dinner, right? We're not sick. It's the patient that's sick. But having seen what happened in China, what happened in Italy, what was happening in New York to our colleagues, I assumed I was going to be sick. Now, did I know I was going to die? No, but it was on the table in a way that it never had been before. The book originally was about describing an unjust society and its human impact, and a healthcare system that then adds insult to injury if you're poor and if you're Black. But then COVID laid bare those parameters and laid bare that situation in a way that was always present and will probably always be present so long as we have a society that's ordered by racial caste and unchecked capitalism. But in this crucible, one where we are all of a sudden vulnerable, where everybody all of a sudden has the potential to fall ill, these fissures were broadened, and it became not only an opportunity to describe a society wrought by these variables, but also, it's a catharsis. Here I am being challenged every day in ways that I haven't been. Here's a way to document what I'm seeing. It also forced me, and then I'll shut up. It forced me to slow down. Like, what am I actually saying? What are the barriers that I've erected between myself and my patients that are self-protective or lazy? Who's in the room with me and why? Where my team? What are we working on? And it became even more important as COVID started getting folks sick. Nurses started falling ill, my colleagues. Security. It reminded me that everybody on this team is necessary, and all of a sudden when they're not there, it's a jarring experience. It's like, I think I might have shared this with you or someone in passing. It's like being in one of those zombie movies where, like, it's a group of teenagers in the woods who should have gone left, but they went right anyway. And they're like looking around, they're all of a sudden, where's Johnny? Oh no, Johnny's gone. Because the zombies picking them off one by one. It was like that in the emergency department. It's like, oh, I haven't seen so-and-so in a couple of days. Yeah, they're sick. They'll be back in a couple of weeks. Some people didn't come back. It was a very, very challenging period.
Paint for us what the ER is like on a day-to-day basis, or what it was like during COVID. You have a line in there when you said, I'm a short order cook flipping burgers at lunch hour. And part of the reason why you chose to write letters to your patients is because you only had 3 minutes with them in the ER.
Some of that was right before, I think that's from the chapter right before COVID, where I was working in a special section of the emergency department where I'm sorting through all of the sick people in the waiting room. I think in that chapter was 45 people when I got there, which was not uncommon at the time. And in those moments, my job was to identify the sickest people, get their workup begun, and send them back to the waiting room to continue waiting, because usually there's nowhere to put them. And in those moments when I only have 3 or 4 minutes, I don't have a chance to really ask more than the critical questions. I'm asking them, where does it hurt? How long has it been there? You know, do you have any fevers or any, similar challenges? And then start their workup, draw blood, send them on an x-ray, send them for radiology, or maybe give them some Tylenol if I have it. There are other parts of the emergency department as well. There's the resuscitation area that turned into like the COVID area with negative pressure rooms. There's like the sort of fast track for ankle sprains. There's the trauma area where all of our car accidents and shootings and falls go. And then there's sort of like a moderate specialty area where people who have chronic illnesses and cancer get managed by a team. And the team is usually an attending physician like me, a number of residents who are physicians in training, a bunch of nurses, respiratory therapists, technologists, housekeeping who keep everything safe and clean, security who make sure that we don't get run up on if there's a shooting. And when we're moving, it's a very smoothly orchestrated flow. And all of that changed during COVID because all of a sudden we had to wrap ourselves in plastic and cover our eyes and breathe through a filter, and everything that had become normal, everything that we were used to doing that we didn't have to think about was just unconscious execution. We had to start thinking, and that slowed us down. What was interesting was between waves, we got that first wave in March, which was, we didn't have any tests back then. They didn't exist anywhere in the country. We had no idea who had what when. Certainly, it seems like we've had vaccines forever, but we didn't have treatments. We didn't have vaccine. We didn't know what to do. Then that sort of abated, and we had this lull period between waves. And during that time, the emergency department was empty because we were still somewhat on lockdown. And people were like, I'm not going to the ER because if I don't have COVID, I'll catch it there. It was just a very, we went from being maddened, crazy, and scared to like, in an 8-hour period, you might see 15 people. It was just a very unusual time.
Can you talk about some of the patients? They're all compelling. I'll let you choose if you want to read an excerpt or just tell us about a couple of the people you write about.
Sure. Towards the end of the book, I talk about working in an area of the emergency department that was sort of like a field hospital. It was reclaimed ambulance bay that we used to expand our capacity in order to care for as many people as we could, as fast as we could. And that ambulance bay was basically, like a big garage, right? So it had open piping and, garage doors that we sealed off. We changed the HVAC to try to make it warm in the winter and cool in the summer. And we rolled out temporary room dividers and gurneys and monitors in order to serve people in this reclaimed garage. And one day in that chapter, I described taking care of a couple people. Now, those people are composites, right? They're based on real people, but they aren't entirely real people because I wanted to make sure that I protected people's identity and wouldn't have any situation where people were concerned that, coming into the emergency department would be unsafe. And so one of the people I described as somebody who had caught COVID in the first wave. Like so many people who caught it that wave, this person had chronic illness, was a Black woman on the South Side, lived in a multi-generational family, and got so sick that she ended up being on a ventilator in the ICU for multiple weeks. That wasn't uncommon on the South Side. We saw that regularly. She came back to us having recovered, having gotten through that episode, but having leftover medical conditions. She had amnesia. She didn't remember any of it. All she remembers is waking up in a skilled nursing facility for rehab. It also impacted her family. Her multi-generational family was fragmented once she was gone. Her daughter had to move out of state. some of that disrupted some of the others in her family. And now not only was she dealing with these ongoing medical problems as a result of this illness, but her social situation became complicated in ways that also impacted her health. Indicative of so many people on the South Side. This is, your health is a function of where you live, learn, work, and play. And so what happens at home is what ends up in your physical body. In the book, I write that across the hall from her was not an older gentleman, but a gentleman who's usually too old for violence, who was in his late 30s, early 40s, who had been shot in the abdomen a few years ago and was coming in with a wound infection. And had spent so much time dealing with physicians that he knew our lingo and exactly what was going to happen. And like so many folks on the South Side, he had lingering medical and psychological issues from being violently assaulted, even though it was many years ago. When you have a violence rate as high as ours, it leaves scars not only on the body, but on the mind and on the community. I mean, there's a collective PTSD that's occurring when you have tens of people being shot. And so I wanted to illuminate that even though we get folks through these acute issues, these health impacts stay. And I also wanted to, in each of these stories, demonstrate that there's a really rare and unusual intimacy between physicians and patients in the emergency department, where these are total strangers. It's an intimacy between total strangers. Somebody I met 5 minutes beforehand, and they're telling me about some of the most intimate details of their lives and some of the most harrowing experiences they've ever had, and trusting me with that information and to do something important with it. If nothing else, I want to honor those relationships with these letters that I was writing to the patients in the book, but also bring into those intimate experiences the reader, so that they see the patients on the South Side and their full humanity, their hopes and dreams, their fears, their wants, and have an understanding that the conditions that led them to us can't stand, that we owe something to one another. And if you can see the humanity in these folks, you can see that any one of us could end up in those situations with a different roll of the dice. So much of this is fortune.
How do your patients respond to you as their doctor?
That's an interesting question, because it's
you've been set up. They've tried to introduce you to granddaughters. I know.
That doesn't happen quite as much anymore that I have all this gray hair. But it feels like family. Sometimes it is family, right? I definitely take care of people who I know and have known, people's parents and old teachers. But I am able to recount shared experiences, right? Like, this happened at this place during that time. I may have had a very similar experience at that place and at that time. I know the difference between Inglewood and Chatham. I know, where some of the lines of demarcation and resources are. And so that allows for a much more rich conversation. And I think that I have a lot of colleagues who have worked alongside me for decades and have the capacity to do those same things and establish rapport. But it keeps me honest, right? It's a very humbling experience, because not only do I know them, they know me. And so I can't front, right? I can't bring airs into the room because we see each other. I think it also might lower barriers that might keep information away. Sometimes all of us have shame about some things, but I think that when they feel as though I am a part of them, part of their community, some of that dissipates and we can have a more honest conversation. I've also gotten better at asking questions. I'm not sure if I'm good yet, but better. Like, you journalists are really good at asking questions and letting people tell on themselves. One of the things I like to do is just say, did you sleep well last night? people tell me their hopes and dreams and fears from that question. They don't usually tell me about sleep. And I'm getting better at just sort of sitting and listening.
I want to pivot away from the personal, because the book isn't only a collection of stories from the ER, which in itself would be a terrific book. I want to talk about public policy and what you saw. And tell us about, I think it was, well, one of the letters you wrote, and I'll keep on the letter theme. You created a composite of I'll just call him a soup doctor, the ER. The University of Chicago really almost did something so egregious that early in your career that you were willing to quit the ER. Tell us about that time.
This is sort of a chapter-long story about how early on in my career, I was a junior faculty member doing research on health inequity and was very interested in creating community medical center partnerships in order to address, the disparities in chronic management of congestive heart failure, where, if you were Black and if you were poor, you ended up in the ER with heart failure. I did all this research, right? I'd done a fellowship. I was ready to go. And the economy turned down, and that meant a lot of people got laid off and lost their health insurance. And that changed everything for hospitals and medical centers around the country, including ours. A number of things were done. One of them was going to be creating a two-tiered healthcare system in the emergency department, where a wall was going to be built. And on one side would be what was called patients of distinction, who were people with chronic or acute medical illness that required a high level of care. But in order to be selected as one of the patients of distinction, you also had to have a certain type of insurance. You had to have private insurance. And on the other side would be an otherwise broadly selected population of patients. Not only, so at the time I was shocked, right? I was young, early in my career, and naive, and was just astonished that all of these things that we knew would create health disparities was being implemented in real time. We knew that two-tiered healthcare system was unjust. We knew that that the way we deliver health should be the sickest first, regardless of their ability to pay. We knew that doing something like this on the South Side would be dangerous. But because of the city's segregation, if you were to say the insured go on one side and uninsured on the other side, the insured side is going to look much whiter than the uninsured side. I mean, they were reconstituting Brown versus Board of Education right in front of my eyes. And that's not why I went into medicine. I knew that I couldn't tolerate that at the time. It was a challenging period. A lot of people stood up in opposition. I was one of them. And at the end, those plans didn't happen. But what I saw was the danger of bystanders. So what I wrote about in particular, and this was a composite because a number of my mentors and leaders stepped down rather than be a party to this plan. And those who were selected to lead in their stead wasn't one person, it was a collection of people. And that's why I made them a composite into an individual. Their effective approach was, this is going to happen, we ought to make the best of it. And sort of stood by why a great evil was being deployed. And it didn't require that they even agree. It just required that they not stand up in a moment and lead towards a moral solution. In the end, one of them actually did help to support the changes that were necessary. But leadership means courage, doesn't it? And healthcare means centering humanity, not profit. And in those moments, I learned these hard truths in the worst possible ways, that going along will mean hurting people if I were to stay in medicine in the same way that I am. And that's kind of why I left academia. That's why I started going on this sort of eclectic professional career to try to understand, how do you both better understand how this system works? What was I seeing in those moments? And how do you deploy resources, leadership, and experience in order to create a more moral and just healthcare system, with the recognition that it's unlikely that we'll ever have a moral and just healthcare system until we have a moral and just society.
The university did not do the plan. Was it because of all the moral outrage?
It was. And it wasn't just me and the other folks inside. There was it was in the New York Times. The emergency medicine physician organization was standing up and upset. There were senior members who were upset. There were a lot of people who were worried and deeply concerned. But not enough that it didn't still become the official plan. This was a socialized and accepted plan that was ready for deployment. They were measuring the wall. It wasn't as though, I'm thinking about a couple things. Let's get some feedback and then decide. No, it was the plan. Until, a small but vocal group of folks raised the alarm and said, no, we can't go back to 1950s. And keep in mind, look, segregation is a meaningful part of our society everywhere, right? We have an implicit two-tiered healthcare system across our nation, not explicit, but implicit in most parts. There was a period where Black folks couldn't come to the University of Chicago at all, right? These things it was going back to a place we'd been, a place we should never go back to. And so standing by and letting that happen wasn't an option for me, not considering that, as we just talked, I come from the place. My patients are keeping me honest. How could I show up and talk to them and say, oh, yeah, I accepted this? No.
Even though we're talking about the University of Chicago, they are part of a system in which this can exist. They were not some sort of outlier.
They were not an outlier. No.
And so here you have this research, one university, care and discovery, brilliant minds studying, curing, healing. And then you have this ER that's mostly poor Black folks.
Yeah.
And you describe in I think a digestible overview for people who are not going to be entrenched in healthcare policy, that this boils down to how Medicaid, Medicare, and private insurance does reimbursements.
Yeah.
You tell the audience the cliff notes in that, because that undergirds all of this. This is why the university was doing this. This is why not just them.
Look, to their credit, well, I shouldn't say to their credit, there are other institutions that have whole VIP floors that one can only access if they're willing and able to pay for it, right? And these are nonprofit institutions in other cities that are explicitly saying, if you have the money, we will build it for you. The challenge is that if you are privately insured or internationally wealthy and can literally pay cash for your healthcare, you provide a margin against what the healthcare you receive costs. If you get Medicare, you might pay about what healthcare costs, maybe a little below that. But if you are on Medicaid, the amount of money that you pay an institution for your healthcare is usually below what it costs them to give you their healthcare. So institutions have organized themselves in order to ensure as many people who can pay have access compared to those who are Medicaid or unable to pay. And that's nationwide. What that leads to are things like VIP floors and special services. That means, plans that ensure you have conduits for special cardiac care or oncology care, and advertising campaigns that are in the communities where the most insured are, where there's a plethora of clinics where folks who are insured exist compared to those who are uninsured and on Medicaid. I mean, look, Inglewood is one of the least insured neighborhoods in the city. It's mostly Medicaid and Medicare. About 12% of folks in Inglewood are uninsured altogether, compared to about 2.5% in Lakeview. If you were to overlay where our healthcare resources are, doctors' offices, clinics, hospitals, and lay them on top of the city, you will see them all densely located on the north side compared to the south side. You'll also see that's where our health status is. You'll see a 30-year life expectancy difference for men between Inglewood and Lakeview. Now, most of that is not a function of the actual healthcare they get. Most of that is a function of living in a community where there is violence, where there are food deserts, where there aren't options to work out, where you work in a job that requires you go double shifts and might be dangerous. Like all of those things track along these segregated racial caste lines that have been instituted in our city for decades. And all that's required to keep that going for more decades is that we sit back as bystanders and not stand up and say, this is unacceptable. And here are the human costs to that. This isn't an economic equation, right? In the book, I describe really clearly how the economics lead us to structure our healthcare system in the way that it is. There are a million solutions, but what's required is that we no longer see this as an economic challenge, but one that's human, right? There is a human manifestation of this caste system, right? There are years lost that are being transferred from poor to rich and from Black to white. If you believe that we are all similarly human, like literally, if you believe we're all similarly human, that can't be tenable, right? You can no longer accept that transfer of years, that unjust and unnecessary suffering. And we created all this. None of this was bestowed by God, right? Segregation was built. These financial motives were built. We can unbuild that if you believe we're all human in the same way. And nowhere do you see that more clearly than when you're in the emergency department, that we are, in fact, all the same.
You referenced your eclectic career. You've always, even if you take another job, you still keep your ER shifts.
Yeah.
But you've worked for an insurance company. Like you've gone to the business side. You became a suit, although you didn't wear a tie, symbolically. But you found even if you were in the system and could try to make changes, that you couldn't affect that change that you were looking for. Can you talk about that phase in your career?
And I'm still working in those phases, right? I'm still trying to understand how can I better shape the system towards one that doesn't put people in profit in conflict, right? And I had success and failure, but the biggest challenge is that we have an entire culture that believes that profit matters more than anything else, that healthcare is simply a business. And in fact, you hear slogans like, we have to run this like a business. Yeah, but businesses sell ice cream. Businesses make shoes. What we're dealing with is something much more precious and different. Like you can always just close a ice cream store and like nobody's any worse off. But here we have to actually think very differently about that. And I think that when you have slogans like no margin, no mission that put people in profit in the same sentence, and in fact, recognize that the people are in service of the profit and not vice versa, as roundly accepted and normal conversation, as opposed to recoiling at the thought of that, this is bigger than one person. There are no heroes here. This is not going to change because the right leader came in. It's going to change when we, as a democracy, say there are certain things that are important, that are bigger than this business endeavor. And then it won't be about one person. It'll be about everybody making a demand that we owe healthcare to one another. We owe a society that doesn't make some people sick at the expense of others. And until then, the best we can do is stop the bleeding, right? just like in the ER, the best I can do is keep these young men and young women who have been shot safe. These folks who have chronic illness, I can help them. I can fix, the sprained ankle and treat the abdominal. But until then, you can create a moral institution. You can be a leader that tries to keep people in profit out of conflict and work on a system. But even that will only be stopping the bleeding in your institution.
I know many people are probably wondering, how do you keep your head in the game? Journaling has been helpful, but you talk about cocaine use,
No, I don't do that.
overeating. No, not you, but how doctors, ER doctors cope because of what you're seeing.
Yeah.
So how do you manage your well-being?
Yeah. Well, I'm fortunate to have plenty of love in my life, family and friends who are like family, who have supported me throughout. You are one of those people. Thank you very much. I have a strong meditation game. I work out regularly. I cook. And if nothing else, I think that part of this even the writing experience has helped me to understand what matters, right? I'm not confused by the transient nature of our time on this planet, and that there really isn't much else besides each other, right? All the other material things are here today and gone tomorrow. And so that understanding came later, right? I don't know if I always had that understanding, but that makes it easy to invest in the people, whether they're my patients or whether they're the people around me. And also, I shared with you earlier that I'm not really reading the reviews or the things like that because I'm not sure what that helps for me, because I know what matters, right? I know who's here. I'm very happy it's being well received because it's honest, and I think that honesty ought to be well received. But what keeps me sane is the realization that it's the people that matter.
Did you have that clarity before COVID?
I was coming into it. Yeah, I think so. But nothing clarifies the world for you like having literally everything stripped away, where there are no restaurants, there's no travel. I had to be careful about how I spend time with my family because I didn't want to infect anybody, assuming that I was always going to be infected. And so while it was an extremely difficult time, it also made clear, well, why am I doing all this? What is this about? What is life, right? And so that sort of helped in many ways. It was a challenge that crystallized many of these notions.
We have a bunch of questions coming in, and so I'm going to turn it over to Lonnie, who's going to manage that part.
What a absolutely fascinating conversation. I know that such great value has been offered to the community, not just in this moment, but when people watch this video later. Really powerful, so impressive. Thank you so much, both Natalie and Thomas. Thank you so much for your engagement with each other and with this topic. It's just brilliant. Love every minute of it. I want to remind folks, we've been putting in links in chat about purchasing a copy of The Emergency. It's a fabulous book. It's a fast read, I might add. It's a page turner. I couldn't put it down. It was next to me all the time. I want to remind folks too that we're going to be doing a buy one, get one free offer. FAN is going to underwrite the cost of a book giveaway, meaning that if you buy a copy from a partner bookseller, the Bookstall, when you get the link to come to After Hours, which is starting right at 8:05, we're going to give Dr. Fisher a 5-minute break in between these two Zooms. Buy a copy, you'll get a link from the Bookstall to register for After Hours. Come to After Hours, and then everyone in After Hours, you're going to get a second copy of the book. So come join us. I mean, what a conversation. I have my own questions, but now let's turn to some of these here. I'm going to start with, we'll go with dealer's choice. And Natalie, you did cover what is a popular question both before the event on the Zoom registration form, but also right now, which is that I find it kind of touching and probably not surprising, Dr. Fisher, that folks want to know, are you taking care of yourself? Like, they're worried for you, they want to make sure
Good.
that you're doing some self-restoration.
Yeah, I'm
And
good.
so I appreciate that Natalie asked that. A question that Lucy is asking is, well, what are 2 or 3 things healthcare executives and policymakers could do to bring more equity and justice into medicine and healing? It's definitely the question of the hour, and you certainly do address it somewhat in the book. Maybe if you could give people a couple tidbits.
Well, I think first of all, it's important to note that there is an extensive body of work that demonstrates solutions that improve health equity. Everything from collecting and using data to guide interventions, to paying for equitable outcomes rather than just hoping that they come into play, to community-based resources and extending services outside of the medical center. I think so many of those are founded on some 3 similar premises that I talk about more in the book. And those are: moral leadership is imperative. There is nothing but influences. There are myriad influences that are telling you that your balance sheet is the most important component of your healthcare system. That is not true in healthcare. That cannot be true in healthcare. There must be a moral imperative that what you are doing is something that is bigger than a profit loss. The other thing is creating systems. Anything that is dependent on re-educating, whether it's an employee or a patient population, will fail. That we must, or that's requiring that either a villain is removed or a hero put in place, that will also fail. We need system solutions because it's systems that are creating inequity. And that at all points in every decision, there must be humanity at the center. So much of what happens in this crucible that I described early in my career, where a wall was being built, was there wasn't any race in that conversation. There was no, well, we want to harm this population. But once you center humanity and ask, if we do this, what will its impact be on people? You can get yourself out of that trap on your own. And so centering humanity in all of your work is the third thing. But I also want to reiterate that, as I said earlier, until we create a just society, we're not going to get there, because these are not economic or even leadership questions. These are moral questions. This is about, what do we owe one another? And do we see one another as fully human? Will we allow our racial caste system to dictate our outcomes, or are we willing to dismantle that? Until we make those big questions and bring those into our conversations, we'll be stopping the bleeding, which is important, but that won't solve this.
Yeah, that question of how do people keep the notion of that we are an interdependent species? Is this front of mind or not?
Yeah.
Does it matter to people or not? And it is a key moral question, because if you do believe that you are interdependent and that you need and you are needed, like how do you, it forces morality to the front of that thinking. And I wish I could feel super confident that everybody felt that way, but I'm sure you can speak way better than I can on that topic.
Well, what's funny is people intrinsically know it, right? When you are sick, as everybody falls ill at some point, when you are sick, the last thing you're thinking about is your social status or your financial status. When your niece, nephew, daughter, parent is critically ill, you know that what we are is beholden to one another. You know it in your heart. The challenge then becomes, well, what about when they're on the South Side? What about when they're on the border? What about when they're in Ukraine? Do you then see their struggle as your struggle? Are we all similarly human? I see it all the time when people are in these moments where they are shedding all of their social structures and reveal those quietest and most shared components of themselves, the things that make them most human. But most people don't have those opportunities that I do in the emergency department. I try to show them in the book.
Well, you see people in states of extreme vulnerability, obviously, and precariousness. I'm going to flip here to a question from Sun He. She asks, given that emergency medicine has become a source of neighborhood primary care, and yet it is a facility where you are essentially doing triage to make sure beds are available for the most critical trauma cases, How do you try to reconcile the disparity in resources where primary care is not available in your community and many communities?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big, big challenge. I mean, to take a step back and look at the biggest picture, the most important contributions to our health have nothing to do with the healthcare system, right? Do we have jobs? Is the water safe? Is there the opportunity to be gainfully employed and walk in our communities? Those are the things that matter most to our health. The next challenge is, are we investing to ensure those things exist? Right now, in most of the communities that need the most, what we're investing in are not the businesses and the built environment that would allow for people to have intrinsic health. We're investing in hospitals and healthcare centers and the police. That's where the majority of our social investments are. And so people come to us in the emergency department for all kinds of things. I mean, we let folks in the winter sleep in the waiting room with a warm sandwich and a blanket. We help people who have been kicked out of their home find a place to live. We do all sorts of things that certainly could be done with primary care or another healthcare outlet. But what we need are really resources in the community so people aren't using any healthcare because they're healthy. Right. The way we better allocate our healthcare dollars is very important and largely a function of some of the economic conversation that we already began. But I'd really much rather we invest in our communities.
We're at 7:58, and I want to make sure that I give both you and Natalie a chance to kind of offer some closing thoughts here. I want to remind folks we're going to close out here in about 2 minutes. We're going to give Dr. Fisher about a 5-minute break here before we open up after hours. Please come join us. As you can see, we've just kind of in some way scratched the surface of an enormous topic that I know many people, of course, have a point of view. So Natalie Thomas, would you like to offer anything in closing?
Nothing from me. I'll just turn it over. I'm just grateful to be here in conversation with my friend, and so glad that this book is getting the attention that it deserves.
Thanks, Nat. I really appreciate our ongoing dialogue that continued tonight, but has been going on for 20 years. Fan, thank you so much for having us. This has been just such a pleasure. One World has been just such an amazing home for this book that helped see that I was a writer before I was a writer. And I just feel really thankful for my patients who have, for 20 years, reminded me what matters and revealed to me what's going on in our society in a way that that I couldn't see in any other way. And so, thank you for having us. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm grateful to One World as well. We've hosted many of their authors, and they do an extraordinary, we work with a lot of publishing houses, we love them all, but One World does an extraordinary job in supporting their authors and the content. It just feels so mission driven. I know that when we're being presented with a One World author to present to our community, we know it's going to be great, and we know it's just solid support. So bravo, great job.